Hello, World Economic News Friday. Pragmatic Capitalism. An article entitled "The Austrians Are Intrigued," and it at the moment runs to 313 comments. If you happen to be into Austrian economics or MMT or interested in anything like that, it's worth spending an hour or two reading the whole damn lot. MMT is catching on, says Cullen. And rightfully so, after all. It is the only accurate description of a modern fiat money system that exists in modern economics. One group in particular is intrigued by our work, Austrian economists, and they should be intrigued because MMT debunks much of their work. And you can imagine that's caused a lot of these 313 comments. And Cullen Roach has played a beautiful game all through the comments, keeping calm because things have been flying around. Lots of toys thrown out of lots of prams. The math is irrefutable. When the private sector is desirous of paying down debt and acquiring increased savings, those savings must come from somewhere. Now, you might want to pause and read this. This is biblical. I'll start again. When the private sector is desirous of paying down debt and acquiring increased savings, those savings must come from somewhere. As the MMT work on sectoral balances proves, these savings must come from the foreign sector, out of the country, in, or the government sector. Where else are they going to come from? With the US now running a current account deficit of 4%, it is imperative that the government sector run a deficit in excess of 4% in order for the private sector to be able to save. So that's if you've got a current account deficit of 4%, the government needs to spend a deficit of 4% just to get things balanced before we start deciding then what's going to happen on the private side. If this were not the case, the private sector would be forced into deficit and the economy would contract. This occurred repeatedly in Japan in the 90s and is currently occurring in the periphery nations of Europe. Moving on. This is the graphic for Martin Wolf's latest article in the Financial Times, the Eurozone's journey to defaults. And those are the peripheral nations taking no notice of MMT, or at least the Oberleutnants in Berlin and Belgium not taking any notice. And that is what's going to happen. Some, with the right sort of deficits, will be up front having a good time. The rest will be falling out the back. Wall Street Journal, UK trade deficit grows despite record oil exports. UK still exports some oil. London, the UK's trade deficit grew more than expected in March despite record oil exports due to a drop in foreign sales of intermediate and capital goods, official data showed Wednesday. Calculated risk trade deficit increased to 48.2 billion in March. This is the United States. Total March exports 172.7 billion, imports 220 billion. Difference about 50 billion. China Daily. China's April trade surplus stands at 11 billion. China's exports increased about 30% in April from a year earlier, up to $156 billion worth. Imports rose as well, but only 21%, 22% to reach 144 billion, giving them a positive of 11 billion. Right. From yesterday and inflation and deflation, I've decided that anybody now that talks about inflation or deflation is to be ignored, because either they don't know what they're talking about, or they do know what they're talking about, but they're talking to people that won't have the same idea about what inflation and deflation is. So they're just not very good at communicating. They might know what their idea of inflation or deflation is. They might be putting it over. But unless they put over every single time critically exactly what they mean by inflation or deflation, they're wasting their time, because everybody else out there, since this credit crunch of 2007 came on, the ideas about what inflation and deflation have just grown out all over the place, and nobody really now has a clue what inflation and deflation is. So I would highly recommend ignoring the words completely, just not using them. This chart below, global currency reserves, is we might use it later, but China runs surpluses, makes a lot of extra money, and has to do something with it. So does Japan, other Asia, other developing and other industrials. Forget the inflation and deflation. From this is just money that came out from the East, let's say, and flooded the West. And the West borrowed this money. What we've had in the West is a boom. You can say from 2002 to 2008, you can go back 10 years, 15 years, some would go back 35 years. But for this, we're saying at least 2002 to 2008, we have been through a boom. And now we are going through a bust. Forget inflation and deflation. We've had a boom, and now we're having a bust. China commodity imports for April. This is vaguely important. These are the different things. Copper. Let's start with crude oil on the right. Crude oil. The amount paid for the crude oil they've imported has cost an awful lot more year on year from the April before. It's cost a lot more in that purpley blue thing. But the amount of oil that they've imported, not much more at all, but it just cost more. Iron ore cost more, positive, but they've actually imported less year on year. Soya beans cost more, imported less. Aluminium cost more, imported less. Copper cost less because they imported a lot less. China is slowing down. And if China's slowing down, who is accelerating? No bugger, that's who. Global Insight from Gillian Tett. If I love anybody, it's Gillian Tett. Policymakers learn a new and alarming catchphrase. Another week, another wave of dismal fiscal gridlock in Washington. But as US politicians squabble about how to cut the deficit, another concept with a catchy name is quietly starting to creep into the policy debate, and it is financial repression. Read the article because it's Gillian Tett. Take this from the article. Ms. Reinhardt and Sbranksia, that's Reinhardt, Carmen Reinhardt of Reinhardt and Rogoff of the book It's Different This Time, or It's Different This Time, something like that, argue the world has forgotten that the widespread system of financial repression played an instrumental role in reducing or liquidating the massive stocks of debt accumulated during World War II. What we forget is, in our lifetimes that we've been thinking about these things, free market this, that and the other, money all over the place. It was in the 80s you couldn't take money out of the UK. You know, about 50 quid was max you're allowed to take out. It was financial, whatever they're calling it. What's she calling it? Catchphrase, financial repression. Financial repression played an instrumental role in reducing or liquidating the massive stocks of debt accumulated during World War II, similar to what we have now. Between 45 and the 80s, they say, the US and UK's annual liquidation of debt via negative real interest rates, negative interest rates, the amount of money you can get in the bank account is less the amount of inflation, on average amounted to 3 to 4%. That's a lot. similar to what it is now, a lot, of GDP per year, or 30 to 40% of GDP debt reduction over a decade. Do you think they might want to go back to that? Now, we could go back to that chart of, I'll put it in here now. Let's go back to it. Global currency reserves. China, Japan, other Asia, other developing and other industrial have had all these extra profits that they're throwing out to the rest of the world because they don't want to keep them in their country because it causes too much inflation. Now, if everyone starts rejecting this money and saying, well, we'll keep our money in our country, that'll guarantee that that money has got nowhere to go except for buying government bonds. It's a different way of going about things, but it's a possible out for them. Basically, what we're looking at here is a great sucking in and keeping in of all monies like they did before 1980, and using the interest rate differential of real interest rates to eventually pay off these debts, or continue the great splurging outwards, either using the Chinese, Japanese and extra savings from the East, or printing new money. Moving on, Japan, nuclear power expansion plans are abandoned. Japan is to abandon plans to expand its nuclear power industry and make renewable a key part of its energy policy, the Prime Minister Naoto Kan said in the country marked 2 months since the tsunami disaster. So they're going to changing their track, going to divert away from nuclear and into green renewables. Good luck with that. It's going to cost big bucks. So that would be either where are they going to get the big bucks from? This is what this video is about. Where are they going to get the big bucks from? Continue, like in Japan, trapping all the savings of the Japanese, but that amount is dwindling, printing more, or using Chinese savings. That's the thing. Where are they going to get the money from? Where's everyone going to get the money from for this sort of thing? And on that subject, a decent article by Jeremy Rifkin in the Financial Times. Only an energy internet can ward off disaster. Now listen to this. This is vaguely interesting, that Rifkin is riffing well. This year has seen ever higher prices at the pump. Rebels seizing Libyan oil fields and nuclear facility crippled in Japan, yet few have realized that these disparate events are part of a larger unfolding drama. Over the peak. Our global energy economy, long powered by fossil fuels and nuclear, is spiraling into a dangerous and unstable end game. In the first decade of this century, the emerging nations led by China and India brought 1/3 of the human race into the declining oil era. Global output rose, and because every activity in our economy requires carbon-based energies, huge demand pressure was placed on diminished fossil fuel reserves. 2 paragraphs in and doing well. Let's keep going. Paragraphs 3 and 4. When the oil price passed $125 a barrel in early 2008, the folly of constructing a civilization on exhumed carbon deposits became clearer. Looking back, we can see that we hit peak globalization, the outer limits of an economic system dependent on fossil fuels. By July 2008, oil had risen to $147 a barrel, precipitating a slowdown in the global economy. This was the economic earthquake that signaled the passing of the oil era. The financial collapse 60 days later was merely the aftershock. This is now happening again, sped forward by Libya and Fukushima. 2010 saw a tepid recovery, mostly to replenish exhausted inventories. But as growth resumed, oil rose too. It now hovers at about $110 a barrel, forcing up prices. Indeed, this is precisely what one would expect from an oil era entering long, slow death throe. Each time output throttles up, oil prices rebound, purchasing power drops and the economy stalls. Not bad, eh? One more paragraph. In the coming era, this is later in the article, to create an energy, we will need to create an energy internet to enable hundreds of millions of people to produce green renewable energy in their homes, offices and factories. They can then store this energy as hydrogen and use green electricity to power their buildings, machinery and vehicles. Surplus electricity can then be shared with others, just as now we share information online. So we move from a good solid description of what might have happened to dreams. Where are these dreams going to get implemented from, and who's going to pay for it all? Good weekend. Bye.